Today is November 2nd, 2025. And who did you work for?
Cordell Construction Company.
And who did you fly with?
Dale Barnes, who flew in a Merlin Swearingen SA 227. Dale was an XL-line pilot. He had lots of time, probably 15, 20,000 hours, so he had a lot of time. I mean, he was an older guy, so he'd been around. And so he was flying. Supposed to go to Miami. We had enough fuel for 8 hours. And what happened, the Captain Dale, overloaded the airplane with fuel. Well, we had a lot of fuel, but the problem was we had a lot of people to fill the airplane up. So we were already over gross weight before the people even got on the airplane. So I was a little upset about that too. So anyway, the way the runway went, one way went over the water, the other way went towards a big mountain. So Dale was going to go ahead and take off towards the big mountain because of prevailing winds or what have you. So he and I got a little argument over it, and we had lots of fuel for at least 8 hours of flying. The flight was supposed to only take about 4 hours from there to Miami, something like that. So we decided, okay, we're just going to taxi back, and we're not going to take off towards the mountain. We're going to go the opposite direction and take off over the water because the runway was a little short. And I think that's why we were there, to lengthen the runway. Cordell Construction was, I think, in the process of lengthening the runway. So we went ahead and took off towards the water. So we took off towards the water, and our climb rate was very, very slow. We were pretty heavy. We had argued over the overweight and with the fuel and all that. And so anyway, we were okay. We didn't have an engine failure or anything. We were climbing only like 50, 100 feet per minute, but ultimately we did okay, and we're on our way towards Miami. The weather was good, but then as we went by the Grand Caicos Islands and some of those islands there along the way, and everything was fine. We were on course, and we used low-powered beacons for navigation because VORs didn't have VORs over the ocean, so we used the low-powered beacons at the time. So anyway, we were pretty well on course. We cruised on up to I think we were probably about 15, 20,000 feet, something like, probably 15, 20, somewhere around in there, 15, 20,000 feet. And we were above the clouds. It was getting dark. And then ultimately, I was flying. Dale was in the back talking to the owner, Cordell, and some of his family members. And then I noticed that as we were tracking the beacon and all, that we were drifting away, like it was showing that I couldn't stay on course. And so I got on a little PA system and called him in the back and told him to come up front. And came up front, I was in the left seat. And I told him, I said, Dale, something going on here. I am trying to push the needles one way, but then the needle, as I turn, it keeps following me. Something's wrong. And he says, I remember him saying, well, let Daddy here show you how it's done, So he just got in the left seat. I went in the right seat, co-pilot seat. And Then as he was navigating, he noticed the same thing as there was some kind of disturbance with the directional gyro, where it was just following us as we were making turns. The needle should, let's say we're making a left turn and going to Miami, then of course the needle should be pushed over to the right. But as we were turning to the left, the needle was following us to the left. So that just wasn't going to work out. So time went on and time was passing, and like I said, we had really a lot of fuel there, but yet as we kept on going, we don't know what really happened, but finally he said, okay, we're going to have to take a heading no matter what, and a northwest heading of some kind, like 300 degrees or something to 11. We're going to have to hold it no matter what the needle does, because we need to keep going to go to Miami. Well, as time went on, this didn't get any better, and as we were tracking the beacon, things we still couldn't get the needles to do what they were supposed to do, because they were just swinging around, and something was going on with that. So we ended up, we were over the Atlantic, of course, and so as time went on, I had my maps, and I was trying to cross some radials, some lines from different beacons, and when I was taking some lines from these beacons, drawing some lines on the map, I couldn't cross the lines. So if you have a beacon to the right, beacon to the left, and you draw straight lines from there, that they should cross wherever you're at. The lines should cross. Well, I couldn't do that. I couldn't cross lines from a couple of beacons that we had access to. If you take some triangulation from different beacons, it's simple math. You got two beacons. You got one that's, let's say, 70 degrees off to the right, another one that's on a 330 degrees to the left, and you get a dual MI, which we had, which two needles that could point to these two beacons. You take the direction from the tail of these needles, and you take the tail of those needles and you draw a line, okay? And ultimately these lines have to cross where your position is.
Right.
But these lines could never cross. They would never cross. You know, they might just track parallel to each other or something. You can't have that. We could not talk to any air control, radar, or anybody. We did not have a high frequency radio. So all we had was just regular radios in the airplane, and we couldn't contact anybody. So we just kept on going on this heading and going and going on and going on. Time was going by, the fuel was going down, with no concept of passage of time. So ultimately, we knew we were over the Atlantic. We knew that something happened. We were either very high crosswind, which would have been unusual this time of year to have such crosswind at such an altitude. But the jet stream just never gets that down low down the southern area that way. So we went on to a point where we tried to get a VOR from somewhere, from anywhere, and try to talk to anybody. Whereas we got further out towards the end, before we went to Nassau, I couldn't talk to anybody. Finally, I talked to ATC, air traffic controller, somewhere. It was faint on the radio, but I was able to contact ATC and say, well, look, we'll try to do a directional line from you or wherever to try and figure out where you're at. And they could not do it. They couldn't figure out where we're at.
Wow.
Yeah. And just hoping that I could get a VOR. A VOR is usually what's on land that you can track, you know, like airways that have imaginary airways off of VOR. And I couldn't get anything for quite a while. So I know that there was an island there, Nassau. So Nassau had a VOR. So I sit there and I had that dialed in, and I wasn't getting anything yet. And finally I started picking up, the needles were swinging around a little bit for the VOR. And all at once I started getting a VOR signal from Nassau. but we only had maybe at that time something like 400 pounds of fuel, which is not a whole lot. And so I started getting a steadier needle to go to the VOR, which was way to the left. So I started tracking the VOR, and also has the DME, which is distance measuring equipment. But I wasn't picking up a DME like a distance of how far we were from Nassau. But I was getting the VOR, so that was a relief to get the VOR. So we started tracking the VOR. And at that time, for some reason, I was tracking the VOR, I got the DME, which can give you a ground speed, and we were only doing like 90 miles an hour, 90 knots ground speed, which was really odd, which would indicate a very strong crosswind or something. So we started tracking the VOR, which was a good thing. The only thing is, we were out over the Atlantic, and it took a while to go to Nassau. Nassau was not a destination. We didn't have much fuel. The weather was low and only had a non-precision approach available at Nassau. So we were low on fuel. We knew that when we were going to shoot an approach, we knew by that time we only had maybe 200 pounds of fuel or something like that on board. We were really low on fuel. We knew that if we shot that approach at Nassau, there was no going to be any go around. We could not go around. We had to go ahead and do the non-precision approach of all things and land at Nassau.
So you were pretty much burning on fumes.
We were committed to land. I mean, we didn't have hardly any fuel when we landed, but we did make it in. We somehow broke out of the clouds and was able to land in Nassau, which we didn't have anything pre-approved to land in Nassau because it's an international airport. So we went ahead and landed, and which was a huge relief because we landed with hardly any fuel on board. So after we landed, of course, we didn't have any papers, we didn't have, I don't know, we probably had passport. We weren't pre-approved to get out of the airplane. So we had to stay in the airplane. Everybody put some money together to pay for fuel because we couldn't get out. They wouldn't let us get out and go to the terminal. We weren't allowed to do that because we didn't have the papers to do that. So we sit on the ramp. They refueled the airplane. We paid them in cash. And then we ended up taking off and went on to Miami.
So now you said you had fuel for 8 hours.
Yeah, I don't know where it went.
Did you fly for 8 hours?
Well, somehow we couldn't account for the time. It was almost like there was a time span where we couldn't account for. We couldn't account for the time that we spent out. There was like a void of time. We know, how can we have 8 hours of fuel for a 4-hour trip and yet end up with fumes landing at Nassau, which was before our destination? So anyway, the very strange things is we were over the Atlantic. We had no way to figure out where we were at. And we had no way to really we had lost a sense of time. We just, like we were in a weird time zone where we lost track of time. We couldn't account for the time that we flew. I mean, there was an extra 4 hours of fuel there that we couldn't account for. So anyway, we did land in Nassau. That really saved us and shot a non-precision approach there. Then we went on to Miami, and we landed pretty well uneventfully. And that was it for that trip. But then when we got home, we had Bendix equipment, which is what we use for beacons over the water. And Dale called Bendix Corporation and asked him, if they ever had some reports that way of anything. There had been another report before of something similar to that, where they were unable to track a beacon there over water in that area there, So the Bermuda Triangle is really It happened to other people, let me put it that way. So, and that was before, of course, you know, any of the new equipment that we have today. We didn't have anything like that. And we did install a high frequency radio, so at least maybe we'd be able to talk to controllers or somebody somewhere. But anyway, he reported that to the people that make the radio, Bendix Corporation. And there had been some reports. And there was another pilot that had a simulator, a corporate pilot had similar situation one time that happened to him. So it wasn't just an isolated incident, it's happened to others during that time. We're talking back in the 70s and 80s here. So
this was in the 70s when this happened?
The 70s, maybe early 80s. And so anyway, we didn't get any answers for any of this. The only thing we knew is install a high frequency radio in case that happened again, so we could talk to somebody and not get lost, you know, in that Bermuda Triangle. But there is something about the Bermuda Triangle. I can attest to that. It happened to us, and it's a fact. It happened, and probably lucky we're here today. Probably the only time in my career of flying where my knees were shaking. My knees were shaking under the map, because not so much that I was scared, of course, and you know, we're at nighttime over water and landing in the water in the ocean at night. I mean, your odds of making it through are almost none.
So now you flew for the American airline for how many years?
21 years, American,
21
after
years.
all that.
Have you had any other things that scared you as much?
No. This was the scariest part. Nothing in my whole career of 30-some years of flying equaled that, because that was something where you couldn't explain. You just couldn't explain it. And all the knowledge that I had didn't work. And like I said, my knees were shaking. I had a map spread out, different maps. I had instrument maps on me. I had regular maps, all kinds of maps on my knees. Is there something that went on out there in the triangle? Probably in those days when they didn't have GPS, they didn't have that. That would probably explain what happened there. There's probably some disturbances there of some kind, which have been proven by other airplanes, smaller aircraft, ships, and what have you.
Ships, yeah.
So something happened during those times where we didn't have GPS. You know, I think that once we were able, with technology, to have GPS, that probably nobody ever experienced that again. Now, they may have experienced some disturbances, but you didn't have to use low-powered beacons for navigation. You know, so, you know, ships used it, aircraft used low-powered beacons. There was low-powered beacon airways, we call it. So, anyway, that's the story about that. So anybody thinks that there's nothing with the Bermuda Triangle, or there wasn't in those days, there was. The biggest thing, to summarize the whole thing, is not knowing where we were, and also losing time, not knowing where time went. The Merlin was able to fly for 8 hours. Very few airplanes could have fuel to fly for 8 hours.
Yeah.
We had enough fuel for 8 hours for a 4-hour flight. So yes, where did the time go? I don't know. I don't know where it went. I know that we landed short on fuel, short of the States. Okay, we were short of Miami where we were going. So we have, that's the worst part, is the fact we didn't know where we were, couldn't talk to anybody. We were drifting at sea over the Atlantic, and we couldn't account for the time that was lost, which would be about 4 hours of fuel. That we were out there flapping around over the Atlantic, and I don't know where we were, but yet it was supposed to only take 4 hours. That's the issue. 8 hours of fuel, for a 4-hour flight, not being able to account for the time lost.
Alrighty.
That's it.